Typically, when I think about a political gospel, I always think of the Gospel of Mark. But Luke begins his gospel pushing against some social and political norms. In a society run by men, he places two women at its center at a time when women were second-class citizens at best. He places these two women in the very beginning, in the center of a story at a time when all the stories that were mostly written by men and for men and about men. Women had their place, and it certainly wasn't in the center of the story. And as Luke begins, the men are absent. Joseph has disappeared from the story, and Zechariah, who has been struck mute, is silenced. And so we are left with the voices of these two women. And they both find their voices in Luke, so much so Mary is given 10 full verses to speak her truth into the world. So Luke places Mary in the very first chapter of his gospel as a prophet. And this prophet tells us who God is, who God has always been, and who God will continue to be. This very concept of placing women at the center is subversive all by itself. But it isn't just the placement of her words and the amount of words she is given to speak that is subversive here. It's the very God that she reveals. That this God is subversive to the way the culture is operating. Because this God that Mary teaches us about in this Magnificat, this is a God who scatters the proud, who brings down the powerful, who lifts up the lowly, who fills the hungry with good things, sends the rich away empty. This is a God who turns the social and political order on its head. The God that Mary proclaims to us in these 10 very important, significant, and beautiful verses is a God who transforms history. A God that does not live and move in the center of society or the center of religious culture, but a God who constantly moves at the edges, at the margins. So through two women, both on the margins themselves, both poor, both women, and both pregnant, one pregnant too young, probably around 14, and the other one pregnant too old. And through these two women on the margins of society, God makes a social and political promise of a new kind of future. Luke's God makes a clear call to the early church, to Luke's community of people who had grown a little complacent about their place as Christians in the world. This chapter, these words by these women, and especially by Mary, are Luke's clear call to participate in this subversion. Not to watch it from the sidelines, but to fully participate in turning it upside down, to bringing about the reign of God the way God wants it reigned in. It's a call to live out what it means to accept God, who defines God's self in terms of the weak and the oppressed, a God who works through the lowly and the poor, and in this case, very significantly through women. Now, I was raised in the Catholic Church. Wasn't a lot of room for women there. And so when I left the church, I shopped around a lot. I've been all the places. There's a lot of them, by the way, but I've been to all the places. And I landed in the United Church of Christ for two fundamental reasons. The first, because the United Church of Christ believes in an open table. You are welcome at this table. That was not true in the Catholic Church. And the second reason that I became a member and then ordained in the United Church of Christ is because of its willingness to answer this call, this very call to subversion, and to live it out, to participate in this kind of subversion, and to align itself with people at the margins. The United Churches of Christ's stance on social justice, on peace, on equity, their courage to lead on these issues, even when they were the lone voice, is a primary reason why I stand before you today. So let me remind you just for a second of exactly how profound this leadership has been. In 1700, the Congregationalists, our ancestors, were the first to take a stand against slavery. The first. In 1785, the United Church of Christ was the first denomination to ordain an African American pastor. In 1853, the United Church of Christ ordained the first woman pastor, Antoinette Brown. She's got a great story. You should catch up on that. In 1959, the United Church of Christ intervenes at the request of Martin Luther King Jr. when Southern TV stations imposed a news blackout of the civil rights movement. And because of their intervention, from the United Church of Christ Office of Communication that organized all the churches in the country, the courts made them reverse that rule so that the airwaves were public property. And they had to cover the civil rights movement. In 1972, the United Church of Christ ordained the first openly gay minister to serve in the Christian churches. In 1976, the General Synod elects its first African American as president, the first African American leader of a racially integrated mainline church. And in 2005, the United Church of Christ put itself on the forefront of the fight for marriage equality. This is the United Church of Christ. This is what it means for a denomination to hear the call of God as shown by Luke through Mary. It means doing the hard thing. It means getting out of our comfort zone and having our comfort disrupted for the love of God, for the love of each other, for the love of the gospel. This is what it means when we talk about making room for God in Advent. It means allowing God to take up some space in us, even in the most uncomfortable corners of where we live. I'd like to leave with you, because the Magnificat is written in language that is so old, right? And sometimes difficult for us to apply to our lives. There's a midrash, a contemporary midrash on the Magnificat by Ken Sehested that I will share with you as I close. And Ken writes, "My soul magnifies you, O Lord, and my spirit rejoices in your saving presence. Everything in me comes alive when you look in my direction. No longer will I languish among the unnamed, the unknown, or the unworthy. Hereafter, for generations, when my name is spoken, all will know it echoes the wonder of your mercy. Your power is sufficient to baffle the aims of the arrogant. Imperial might trembles at the sound of your approach, but the prison yards and the sweatshops and the slaughterhouses erupt in jubilation. With your arrival, the bailout bounty will flow to the hourly wage earners, and the stock-optioned executives will apply for food stamps. In the land of lies and deceit, in the season of bankrupt promises and boardroom corruption, the lair of every heir to every privilege and every power will be confounded by the herald of your promise. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. And blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus. Amen.